So I thought we could have a bit of a chat about the roles in SAFe and how they compare with the classic 3 Scrum roles that we're all familiar with. So in Scrum, nice and simple, you've got the product owner responsible for the business, the long-term strategy, the value. Scrum Master is responsible for the process, making sure that everything is working effectively. And then the development team actually have to build it, and also they're in charge of the technology and the technical practices. But in SAFe, there's not 3 roles, there's at least 12. So I thought we could have a bit of a look at the picture and see how they sort of map, see how they sort of
and isn't it the case though that even those 3 original Scrum roles, there's kind of extra accountabilities that are part of the SAFe framework as well?
There are a few differences, yeah. If you read the Scrum guide and then if you read the SAFe sort of resources, the documentation, there are a few sort of subtle differences. But actually, one of the patterns that you get from Scrum also applies in SAFe. It's just that, as you'd expect, it scales. There are sort of extra levels of responsibility. So if we start with the basics, if you look at the bottom of the sort of the picture, you've got the thing that you're familiar with. You've got agile teams, then you've got a development team who build the stuff, a product owner who works out what that team should be building. They organize the priorities at that sort of level, and a Scrum Master working at a team level, looking at those things. And they're kind of responsible for the individual team level artifacts. Each product owner looks after their own team backlog. The Scrum Master looks after their own sort of team, their sort of sprint backlog, their plans, and they operate just as we're all familiar with, working in a series of iterations, building stuff, reviewing it, having demos, and so on and so forth. The first extra set of roles that you get are scaling that up a level so that now you're looking at what's called an agile release train, which is a virtual team of teams of up to 12 different teams. But one of the things that you see is that you've got the same pattern. You've got a product manager who operates one level above the product owner. They also have a program backlog. The items in that program backlog feed into the team backlogs. And the product manager has content authority at that level. So they decide what the overall agile release train should be working on. They feed that down to the individual teams. The product owners then work at a more detailed level to get it implemented within the teams. Similarly, you got what's fancily called a release train engineer, and you can get to wear a hat, which is a bit of a laugh. And the release train engineer essentially is a kind of a scaled up version of the Scrum Master. So they look after the process at the level above. They look at coordination, they sort of handle synchronization events. And then similarly, scaling up from a team level, the development team is responsible for decision making within their sort of team. You have system architects and system engineers who are really leading the technology at the agile release train level. So over the course of 12 or so teams working together, they're leading, they're mentoring, they're coordinating the technical capabilities at that level.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things we often talk about when we're teaching, the Scrum curriculum is about, so for example, the product owner, we talked about truly owning your product. So I'm kind of curious how we still maintain that ownership at the product owner level down in the agile teams, alongside then having that product manager that's also creating direction.
Well, absolutely. And one of the things we talk about in the Scrum classes, of course, is that there must be just one product owner. If you're doing Scrum, if you want to pass the Scrum exam, you would say there is just one product owner. And we always sort of, make a big point of that in those sort of courses. That role is essentially, in SAFe terminology, the product manager. If you only have one agile release train, and if this is building some big, large-scale product, that product manager has that ultimate responsibility. They're a bit like, the sort of, the CEO of that product. They make the final decisions over what the whole outfit should be doing. But just like we say in the sort of Scrum class, if you get bigger, you're probably going to have to delegate some responsibility. If you're managing the work of potentially up to 125 individuals, you're not going to have time to go to every single sprint planning session. You're not going to have time to attend every retrospective or decide every single user story where that should sort of go in the sequence. So the product manager delegates responsibility to the product owners, and they take a more detailed view about what each individual team should be working on.
Cool. And then similarly with the system architects, One of the things that a lot of Scrum teams frown against is having this kind of ivory tower person that is the approver of and signer off of design documents. So how does SAFe address that challenge?
Well, exactly, and I think, as with anything, you can lead well or you can lead badly. You can be in role as a system architect, and you can take it upon yourself to impose your designs on all the different teams and stamp your authority and say, this is the way that we're going to do it based on the experience that I had over the last 20 years. Or you can be a good leader. You can be more of a mentor. You can see your role as coordinating the activities of all the individual teams, organising, knowledge share sort of sessions, and lead, taking the lead at the inspect and adapt events, and sort of guide the teams in that sort of way. You can help cross-pollinate ideas across the different teams. Maybe one team had a good idea. If you're the system architect, you can sort of make sure that is promoted and shared across the practice.
Yeah. Cool. And then that release train engineer, I think in some of the other frameworks, they call that a Scrum of Scrums master. Would that be a fair sort of description of what they're doing? Then, they're kind of taking that Scrum Master role across multiple teams.
Well, exactly, yeah. So if you think of the Scrum Master track as being about managing the process, making the process as effective as it can be, if you're a Scrum Master, that's done at the team level. You're focusing a lot of attention on individuals and making sure that individuals are working well together, coaching, supporting teams to be self-sufficient. The release train engineer does exactly the same thing a level above. So they're looking at the sorts of issues that crop up where you have a dozen or so teams all working in a similar area, all trying to, drive towards the same sort of goal. So it becomes about coordination. It becomes about facilitating large-scale events like the PI planning event, the program increment planning events, taking place roughly once every 3 months or whatever you've decided. Obviously, there's a big job to prepare for and organise and facilitate those sorts of events, and then throughout the program increment to facilitate it, to make sure that everything is working okay, as well as looking at the process overall, looking at trying to drive improvements in the process in the long term.
So I assume they also then have accountabilities similar to a Scrum Master for removing impediments, but I guess rather than team level impediments, they're more at the program level.
Yeah, exactly that. And there are synchronization events set up for that, and there's sort of forums for that in that sort of way. Cool. So then, if you get a solution train, you just do exactly the same thing. You go one level up. There is no requirement to have a solution train in SAFe. A lot of SAFe practices just have a single agile release train. But if you're substantially scaling up, if you have more than 125 people, more than 12 teams, and you maybe need to organize thousands of people around a particularly sort of big, significant endeavor, then you scale up one more level and you have what's called a large solution articulated in a solution train. And the role pattern follows the same path. You have a solution manager who coordinates a solution backlog, which then feeds down into individual program backlogs and then in turn down to the team backlogs. You have solution architectural and engineers who again have technical authority, and they're sort of leading the technical solution at that sort of higher level, potentially coordinating across multiple agile release trains and working with system architects and engineers to then sort of work with individual development teams to make sure that everything is aligned and is going in the right direction. And then, of course, you have a solution train engineer who looks after the process at that wider scale. So synchronizing across multiple agile release trains and looking to improve the processes and practices at that kind of level.
So it sounds like to me then it's kind of almost like a recursive or a fractal type model where each of those elements is replicated down at different levels.
Yeah, exactly that. It's nothing more complicated than that. You then throw in a handful of other roles. I mean, we all have stakeholders. We all have people, from the business who need to make their sort of representation. So there's a specific role nominated for business owner, and they play a certain role in program increment planning. They sort of set the direction. They provide information at the right sort of level. And then if you're adding on the portfolio level, there's this concept of epic owners. Epics are major undertakings, almost akin to sort of major projects that go through certain sort of governance practices. And there's a nice sort of model in SAFe around the budgeting and the sort of guardrails that can help things be put into place. And there are owners for those sorts of initiatives. And the nice thing about this is that, again, if you start with an organization that has big, long-term strategic objectives, our goal is to get into this new target market or to achieve this significant business outcome, there's traceability all the way through from the organization's top-level objectives through the solution management, down to the product management, down to the product owners, all the way into the specific task that an individual is working on at any given day. So the idea is that, we're trying to maintain agility, but the bigger you get, the greater the overheads. And if you're organizing thousands and thousands of people, you can't just make it up as you go along. You can't just have a single product owner attending every single sprint planning session. You've got to have some sort of approach that scales.
So there's obviously a danger for many organizations to create some sort of top-down directive sort of mandate where, that kind of, epic owner then drives the solutions that then drives the program level or the release train level. And then, then that's all, by the time you get down to the agile team, there's very little autonomy at all. So what's your recommendation there on how you make sure that it doesn't become that kind of top-down mandate and there's still that level of agility?
Well, it's all about balance, and it's all about identifying which decisions need to be centralized and then decentralizing anything else. There's a bit of guidance in SAFe around, which decisions need to be taken by, the sort of person at the top. And it's usually things that take place very rarely, things that have significant economies of scale. The idea is that you would only centralize a decision if it really made sense to do so. I mean, things like your long-term technical strategy. It probably doesn't make sense to have each individual team to decide whether they're going to code everything up in .NET or Java, or whether they're going to use AWS or Azure. There are certain decisions that it makes sense to centralize, and then you decentralize specific actions like, well, which library shall I use today, or how am I going to implement that particular feature? So the general ethos is try to make as much decision making as possible at the ground level, that sort of bottom up decision making.
And that seems like it's fairly consistent with the Scrum Guide, in the sense that the Scrum Guide talks about, say, the definition of done as an organisational wide thing, and it's only where the organisation doesn't have it that should the development teams be creating their own.
Yeah, exactly that. So I think it just comes down to common sense, really.
Sounds awesome.
Nice one.